Carl Jung. For decades, he studied a mystery that the majority of psychologists just ignored. Why were certain children raised with everything, with food, shelter, education? Why were they turning into empty adults, incapable of love, completely obsessed with themselves? He uncovered something profoundly disturbing. It wasn't physical neglect, it wasn't poverty, and it certainly wasn't obvious trauma. It was an attitude, a specific parental attitude, one that created narcissists. And the most terrifying part, these parents, they genuinely believed they were loving their children. They thought they were doing everything right. And right now, at this very moment, thousands upon thousands of children are being molded, shaped in this exact same direction. And their parents, tragically, they have absolutely no idea. This attitude, it has a name in Jungian psychology. Unconscious projection of the parental shadow. It sounds technical, but it's actually terrifyingly simple. The parents, they don't see the child. They see an extension of themselves, an object, a blank canvas, onto which they project their own frustrations, their unfulfilled dreams, their unhealed traumas. The child, they don't exist as a separate being. They exist merely as an emotional tool for the parents. Carl Jung, he called this the psychological death of the true self. The child learns, very early on, that who I am doesn't matter, only who they need me to be. That's what matters. Let's get specific about how this actually happens. It's not dramatic. There aren't screams or violence in most cases. It's subtle. It's daily. It's in the way the mother systematically ignores what the child is feeling, replacing it with how she thinks the child should feel. It's in the father who never asks what the child wants. He only informs the child what they will do. It's in the constant invalidation, disguised as guidance. Are you hungry? No, you just ate. Are you sad? You have absolutely no reason to be. You like art? That's not going to get you anywhere. Each phrase, it's a brick. Brick by brick, the child constructs an emotional prison, and the parents, they are the unconscious architects of that prison. Jung observed that children do something extraordinary to survive this. They create a false self, a persona so convincing that sometimes even they don't realize it's not real. This false self has one mission: to be exactly what the parents project. If the mother needs a perfect child to validate her worth as a mother, the child becomes an obsessive perfectionist. If the father needs a strong child to compensate for his own unintegrated weakness, the child represses all vulnerability. This false self, it's not a choice. It's a psychological survival mechanism. The alternative would be to face a truth that is simply unbearable for a child. My parents don't love me for who I am. And children, they simply cannot survive that truth. So, they become someone else. There's a specific moment when this solidifies. It varies from child to child, but Jung identified the pattern. There's an attempt at authenticity. The child, still young, shows who they really are. Maybe they cry for no apparent reason, just feeling. Maybe they express genuine anger. Maybe they demonstrate an interest in something that the parents actively despise. And then there's the parental response, the invalidation. You're too sensitive. You're difficult. You're disappointing us. In that moment, something dies in the child. Not literally, but psychologically. A part of the true self is buried, and the narcissistic false self is born. The self that will perform love, just to receive crumbs of approval. Now comes the part that most people don't understand about the formation of narcissism, the false self. It's not humble, it's not submissive, It's grandiose. It seems like a paradox, but it makes perfect sense in Jungian logic. The child who was never seen develops an extreme psychological compensation. If the true self is not worthy of love, the false self needs to be extraordinary. It needs to be special, unique, superior. This explains why narcissists oscillate between grandiosity and a deep, profound emptiness. The grandiosity is armor. The emptiness is the truth that they've spent their entire lives running from. I was never loved for who I am. Carl Jung described this as compensatory ego inflation. The child didn't have healthy emotional mirroring. No one reflected back to them, I see you, I accept you, you are enough. So, they create a distorted internal mirror. A mirror that reflects an inflated, grandiose image to fill the hole that real mirroring should have filled. Narcissists, they aren't people who love themselves too much. They are people who were never truly loved and are desperately trying to fill that void with external admiration, with control, with performative perfection. Here's something that will make you pause and think. Narcissistic parents, they were often children treated exactly like this. They're not genetic monsters. They are people who developed this false self in their own childhood and never integrated it. Jung called this psychic inheritance. It's not DNA, it's an unconscious pattern, transmitted from generation to generation. The mother who treats her daughter as an extension of herself was probably treated that way by her own mother. The father who projects his shadow onto his son probably carries an unresolved father complex. The cycle continues. Because no one has done the work of individuation. No one has looked at their own shadow and said, this stops here. Let's talk about what happens in the mind of the child during this process. Jung described the child's psyche as extremely porous. Children absorb everything. They don't have developed filters. When parents project unconsciously, the child internalizes these projections as truth about themselves. If the mother projects that her daughter is selfish, every time the daughter expresses a need, the daughter doesn't think, my mother is projecting. She thinks, I am bad. If the father projects weakness onto his son, every time the son demonstrates emotion, the son doesn't think, my father has a complex. He thinks, I am weak. These toxic introjections, they become the core of the false self. The child begins to believe that the projection is reality. There's a crucial detail about this parental attitude. It's not constant. If it were obvious and constant abuse, the child could defend themselves psychologically, create some distance. But it's not. It's intermittent. Sometimes the parents demonstrate love, conditional love, but love nonetheless. Sometimes there's approval, when the child performs the right role. This intermittence, it's more destructive than total rejection. Jung explained that it creates an unbearable ambivalence. The child gets trapped in a cycle. If I am perfect, I will be loved. And when they receive that crumb of approval, the pattern reinforces itself. The false self works, and the true self, it gets more and more buried, more and more inaccessible. Now, for one of Jung's most profound insights about this, he said that the narcissistic false self is not just compensation, it's unconscious revenge. The child who was treated as an object becomes an adult who treats others as objects. The child who was never seen becomes an adult who cannot see anyone beyond their own reflection. It's not a conscious choice, it's a compulsion to repeat. The unintegrated trauma repeats itself. The unrecognized shadow is projected, and the cycle continues. Carl Jung understood. The adult narcissist, without even realizing it, inflicts on others what was done to them, especially with their own children. Imagine a 5-year-old, Jake. He comes home from school sad because he lost a toy. He needs simple emotional validation that his feelings matter, but his narcissistic mother, shaped by that same parental attitude, replies, "It's just a toy, Jake. You have so many other things. You should be grateful." There's no empathy. There's a projection of the mother's shadow. Probably the mother herself was raised being forced to suppress emotions, being accused of ingratitude when she expressed needs. And now, without awareness, she replicates the pattern. Jake learns, "My feelings don't matter. I only matter when I'm grateful, when I perform gratitude." Just another brick in his emotional prison. Carl Jung was insistent on one thing. Consciousness is the only way out. Individuation. The process of integrating the shadow and recognizing the false self is possible, but it requires brutal work of self-knowledge. It requires that a person look at their wounds without running away, without eternally blaming their parents, but also without denying that the trauma was real, to acknowledge, "I was treated as an object, and now I'm treating others that way." That awareness hurts. It hurts deeply, because it means admitting that the grandiose self you've built isn't you. It's a defense, and beneath the defense is the child who just wanted to be seen and never was. The question that remains is, how do we break this cycle? Jung said it starts with recognizing the attitude. If you're a parent, ask yourself honestly, do I see my child as he is or as I need him to be? When he expresses emotion that makes me uncomfortable, do I validate it or invalidate it? When he has an interest different from what I imagine for him, do I support it or project my own frustration? These are difficult questions because most parents want to believe they love unconditionally. But unconditional love requires an integrated ego. It requires that you have done the work of not projecting your shadow, and very few people do that work. If you're recognizing patterns in your own childhood now, there's a hard truth. Your parents probably won't do that work. They'll probably die without recognizing what they did. Not because they're evil, but because their false self is so crystallized that recognizing it would mean collapsing their entire identity. Jung saw this constantly. People who spent their entire lives protecting their false self because the alternative, facing the emptiness underneath, was too terrifying. Your healing doesn't depend on them recognizing it. It depends on you doing the work of individuation that they didn't do. There's a specific moment in Jungian therapy that marks a turning point. It's when the person stops defending their parents and stops blaming them too, just acknowledges. They did the best they could with the consciousness they had, and their best created deep wounds in me. Both things are true. I don't need to hate them, but I need to name what happened. I need to validate the child inside me, who was never validated. When you can do that, something shifts. The need for compensatory grandiosity diminishes. The false self starts to dissolve, and for the first time, the true self has space to exist. Now, I'm going to tell you something about the parental attitude that creates narcissism that few therapists explain clearly. It's not just about what parents do. It's about what they don't do. It's about absence of real emotional presence. They might be physically present. They might provide everything materially. But emotionally, there's no one home. The child speaks, and there's no one really listening. The child feels, and there's no one really feeling with them. There's a body, but there's no being. This absence creates a psychological vacuum in the child, and they try to fill that vacuum by becoming so special. So perfect, so remarkable that they'll finally be seen, but it's never enough because the problem wasn't the child, it was the parent's inability to be present. Jung described this absence as emotional abandonment. It's more destructive than physical abandonment because it's invisible. No one validates it. There's no social worker knocking on the door. The family seems normal from the outside. The child has clothes, food, school, but on the inside, they're alone existentially. They're growing up in an emotional desert, and the narcissistic false self is a mirage oasis. It seems to save you, but only deepens the thirst. Let me show you how this parental attitude manifests in concrete situations that you probably recognize. A child wins an award at school, comes home radiant, wanting to share. The narcissistic parent glances at it and says, "That's good, but your brother Chris won this last year." Or, "I hope you keep it up." You can't relax. The child doesn't receive celebration, they receive comparison or pressure. The message, your value isn't intrinsic, it's relative to performance and the expectations of others. That child will learn to never be satisfied. They'll learn that success isn't for celebrating, it's for using as currency for approval. Narcissism is born in this distorted emotional transaction. Another situation, a child has a nightmare, wakes up scared, goes to their parents. The narcissistic mother sighs in irritation, says it's nonsense, tells them to go back to bed. There's no comforting of the fear. There's rejection of the vulnerability. The child internalizes. When I need something, I'm a burden. When I feel fear, I'm weak. So they stop asking for help. They stop demonstrating vulnerability. They develop pathological self-sufficiency. In adult life, they'll be the narcissist who can't ask for help, who sees need as weakness, who prides themselves on never needing anyone, but beneath that armor is the terrified child who just wanted comfort and received rejection. Jung realized that adult narcissists usually don't remember these moments as traumatic. The memory has been reprocessed. They say things like, "My parents were strict, but they made me strong." Or, "My mother expected perfection, but it was good. It taught me discipline." This rewriting of history is a defense mechanism. Admitting it was trauma means admitting that the false self was built on a wound, not on strength. And the narcissistic ego doesn't tolerate that vulnerability. So the narrative is, "I'm strong because I overcame it," not, "I'm wounded because I was never loved." The first preserves the grandiosity, the second would require mourning. Now, something that Carl Jung emphasized greatly. Parental projection isn't about what the child did. It's about what they represent to the parent's unconscious psyche. The daughter, whom the mother treats with coldness, might represent the femininity that the mother hates in herself. The son, whom the father rejects, might represent the sensitivity that the father suppressed in his own childhood. The child becomes a screen for the parental shadow, and the tragedy is that they don't know it. They just feel the rejection and conclude that there's something wrong with them. They spend their life trying to fix something that was never broken. Carl Jung, a figure of immense importance in psychology, spent decades delving into a mystery that most psychologists simply overlooked. Why were some children who had everything, food, shelter, education, why were they growing into empty adults? Adults incapable of love, obsessed with themselves? He unearthed something profoundly disturbing. It wasn't physical neglect. It wasn't poverty. It wasn't even obvious trauma. It was an attitude, a very specific parental attitude that cultivated narcissists. And the truly frightening part? These parents actually believed they were loving their children. They thought they were doing everything right. Right now, as we speak, thousands of children are being molded in this direction. And their parents, they have no idea. There's a specific phase where this becomes irreversibly solidified. If there's no intervention between the ages of 7 and 12, Jung called this the latency period of ego formation. This is when a child is developing a more stable sense of identity. If, up until this phase, they've received that attitude of unconscious projection of the parental shadow and systematic invalidation, the false self is no longer a temporary strategy. It is a personality structure. The neural pathways are consolidated. The emotional patterns are automated. The way they relate to the world is crystallized. Reversing it later is possible, but infinitely more difficult. It requires years of deep, therapeutic work. Now, here's something that's going to sound controversial, but Carl Jung was clear about this. The majority of narcissistic parents never change, not because they don't want to, but because they can't. The work of individuation, of integrating the shadow, and dissolving the false self demands the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, paradox, vulnerability. It demands that the person sit with their own emptiness. Narcissists have spent their entire lives fleeing from this very emptiness. Asking them to confront it now is like asking someone to rip off their own skin. Technically possible, but insupportably painful. So they die, protecting the false self, never knowing who they really were. You've just spent the last few minutes discovering the parental attitude that creates narcissism, the unconscious projection of the parental shadow, the treatment of the child as an object, the systematic invalidation, the emotional absence disguised as physical presence. You've seen how the false self is born as survival and becomes a prison, how generations transmit this pattern without awareness. This information isn't in most videos about narcissism. Most focus on symptoms. This video focused on the Jungian root cause. That super thanks button down there isn't just financial support. It's you saying, this deep psychological truth needs to reach more people. Each video like this requires hours, investigating Jung, developmental psychology, case studies. When you click that golden heart, you're funding more content. That goes deep. That doesn't oversimplify. That respects the complexity of the human psyche. You become part of who's bringing serious Jungian psychology to people who would never otherwise have access. Be part of this mission to bring to light the familial shadows that create so much suffering. Back to what matters. How do you use this knowledge now? If you recognized your parents in this pattern, the first step is validation. It wasn't your imagination. It wasn't excessive sensitivity. It was real. The invalidation you felt was real. The emotional loneliness was real. Naming it is the beginning of healing. Naming it breaks the spell. When you can say, my parents projected their shadow onto me, something shifts. You stop trying to be good enough to finally be seen, because you understand that it was never about you. It was about their inability. Second step, recognize your own false self. What parts of who you are were created to survive them? What aspects of your personality are performance, not authenticity? Carl Jung said that this recognition is terrifying, because it means that much of what you think is you is a defense. But it's also liberating, because it means that beneath that defense there's a true self waiting to emerge. A true self that doesn't need to be perfect, special, extraordinary. It just needs to be real. Third step, and this is the most difficult. Don't do to others what was done to you. If you have children, assistants, people under your power, notice when you start to project, when your irritation with their fragility is about your own repressed fragility, when your demand for perfection is about your own inadequacy complex. Breaking the cycle requires brutal vigilance with yourself. It requires that you do the work that your parents didn't do. There's a truth about healing from narcissism that needs to be said with clarity. It isn't linear. It isn't quick. Carl Jung spoke of years of inner work. You'll have moments of profound insight, followed by months, falling into the same patterns. You'll have moments when you hate your parents, and followed by moments when you understand them deeply. This ambivalence is a sign of health, not of weakness. It means that you're leaving the narcissistic split between all good or all bad, and entering into real human complexity. One thing that Carl Jung insisted on is that individuation doesn't mean becoming perfect. It means becoming complete. Complete includes integrating the parts that you hate in yourself, the parts that are selfish, the parts that are needy, the parts that are manipulative. Narcissists deny these parts, project them onto others. Individuation is recognizing, I also have a shadow. I also hurt people sometimes. I also am flawed, and that imperfection doesn't make me unworthy of love. It makes me human. Here's the paradox that Jung loved to explore. You only break free from narcissism when you stop trying to be special, when you accept being common, average, flawed. The narcissistic false self insists, I am exceptional. The integrated self recognizes, I'm just another wounded human, trying to survive in this complex world. There's no glamour in that. But there's truth, and truth, even painful, is more liberating than grandiose fantasy. About your parents specifically, maybe they'll never change, maybe they'll never recognize it, maybe they'll die. Insisting that they were excellent parents, you'll need to grieve, not for the person they were, but for the person you needed them to be. Grieve for the parents who never saw you. Grieve for the childhood that never validated you. That grief has no deadline. It takes the time it takes, but doing that grief is better than spending your entire life waiting for them to finally wake up and acknowledge it. They probably won't wake up, and you can't wait for them to start living authentically. One last thing about breaking the cycle. If you're realizing that you've developed narcissistic traits, that doesn't make you a monster. It makes you someone who survived the way they could. But now, you have a choice that your parents didn't make. You can do the work of integration. You can look at your shadow. You can recognize your projections. You can stop treating people as objects. It's hard work, but it's possible. And every step you take toward authenticity is a break in the generational cycle. What attitude of your parents most destroyed you? Was it the constant invalidation? Was it the conditional love? Was it the emotional absence? Was it treating you as an extension of them, not as a separate person? Comment specifically, because when you name it, you take it out of the unconscious and bring it into the light, and things in the light lose power over you. This space here is to validate experiences that were never validated, to name familial shadows that have passed generations. Hidden, your courage to comment might help someone finally understand that they weren't crazy. There's one manifestation of this parental attitude that's particularly insidious. It's called parentification. This is when parents invert the roles. The child becomes responsible for the parent's emotions. The mother cries, and the 8-year-old daughter needs to console her. The father gets frustrated, and the son has to manage his mood. Jung described this as a devastating archetypal inversion. The child can't be a child. They need to be an emotional adult before they have the psychological structure for it. This child grows up with a distorted sense of responsibility. They feel guilty when others get hurt. They feel obligated to fix everyone. In adulthood, they become the controlling narcissist, unable to let anyone have a problem without trying to solve it, not out of genuine empathy, but out of a compulsive need to control the emotional state of others. Another specific pattern is triangulation. This is when parents put the child in the middle of conflicts, either between themselves or between the child and another sibling. The father speaks ill of the mother to the child, or the mother constantly compares two siblings, creating competition for scraps of love. Jung saw this as intentional psychic fragmentation. The child can't form a cohesive identity because they're constantly being pulled between conflicting loyalties. This fragmentation lays the perfect groundwork for a false self, because a fragmented self can't even know who they are. So, they construct a persona that changes depending on the audience. The chameleon narcissist is born from this early triangulation, and then there's the dynamic of the scapegoat versus the golden child. One child receives all the parents' positive projections. They're perfect. They can do anything. They'll be the savior of the family. The other child receives all the negative projections. They're the problem. They're difficult. They cause all the conflicts. Jung explained that both children develop narcissism, but different types. The golden child develops grandiose narcissism. I am special, superior, destined for greatness. The scapegoat develops vulnerable narcissism. I am a victim. No one understands me. The world is against me. Both are compensatory false selves. Both are responses to parental projections. Neither is the true self. Let me tell you about a case that Jung analyzed, one that perfectly illustrates the parental attitude that creates narcissism. A 40-year-old man came to therapy, suffering from severe depression and an inability to maintain relationships. He was a successful lawyer, wealthy, admired professionally, but he felt a profound emptiness. In the sessions, Jung took him back to his childhood. He had a rigid, perfectionistic mother who was a teacher. Every night she made him read to her. If he missed a word, she would sigh with visible disappointment. If he read perfectly, she would just say, "Tomorrow, you need to read more." There was never any celebration. There was never enough. This man spent 40 years being a brilliant lawyer to try and earn that. "I'm proud of you," which never came. Jung helped him see. He didn't choose to be a lawyer. He chose to be the son his mother demanded. And 40 years later, he was finally starting to ask, "But who am I without this performance?" That's the question that undoes the narcissistic false self. Who am I when I'm not performing, when I'm not trying to impress, when I don't need to be special or superior or a victim? Narcissists run from this question their whole lives, because the answer, at first, is terrifying. I don't know. I spent so much time being what I needed to be that I never discovered who I really am. But after the terror comes possibility. If I don't know who I am, I can find out. I'm not stuck with the script my parents wrote. I can start to write my own. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation has a moment of psychological death. The ego needs to die for the self to be born. For narcissists, this means that the false self needs to be dismantled. And it hurts. It hurts like grief because you're letting go of the identity that protected you for decades. You're admitting everything I built was on a false foundation. But after this death comes rebirth, comes the possibility of genuine relationships, comes the possibility of contentment that doesn't depend on external approval, comes the possibility of inner peace that grandiosity never brought. Here's something that few understand about narcissists. They didn't choose to be this way. No one wakes up as a child and decides, I'm going to develop a personality disorder. It was adaptation. It was survival. It was the best solution the child's psyche could create for an impossible situation. Recognizing this isn't excusing narcissistic behavior in adulthood. It's contextualizing. It's understanding. This person is operating from a system developed when they were 5 years old. A system that made sense then, but doesn't serve them now. And changing a 5-decade-old system is a monumental task. Regarding having compassion for narcissists, Jung was balanced. Yes, understanding the origin generates compassion, but compassion doesn't mean tolerating abuse. You can have compassion for the wounded child who became the narcissistic adult and still set firm boundaries with the adult. You can understand that your narcissistic parents were raised by narcissistic parents and still protect yourself from their toxicity. Compassion doesn't require you to be a victim. It requires you to see the whole humanity, the wound and the behavior, the cause and the consequence. The question that many ask is, should I confront my parents about this? Jung generally suggested, no. Not because they don't deserve to hear it, but because they probably can't hear it. Parents with a narcissistic false self, so crystallized that they've never done the inner work, don't have the psychological structure to process, I hurt you deeply. That truth would collapse their identity. So, what happens when you confront them? Denial, gaslighting, victim reversal. You're accusing us? We did everything for you. You're ungrateful. You leave the conversation more hurt than before. Sometimes, the healing doesn't come from external confrontation. It comes from internal validation. From you saying to yourself, what happened was real, and I don't need their confirmation to move on. The last thing about this specific parental attitude, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's usually a context. Stressed parents, generational trauma, a culture that values perfection over humanity, social inequality that creates anxiety about the future of their children. This doesn't excuse it, but it contextualizes it. Your parents didn't wake up thinking, I'm going to destroy my child psychologically today. They were operating from their own unhealed wounds, their own false selves, their own unconscious programming. Understanding this isn't about forgiving them before you're ready. It's about freeing yourself from the fantasy that one day they're going to change and finally give you what you needed in childhood. They won't, and you moving on with your life doesn't depend on them. Individuation is solitary. You do it alone, not with your parents at your side, acknowledging, not with their validation. You accomplish this by looking into your own shadow, by acknowledging your own false self, integrating those fragmented pieces. And when you undertake this work, something extraordinary happens. The desperate need for their approval begins to dissolve. You stop waiting for them to finally see you, because you are starting to see yourself. And for the first time, it's enough.